Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Georgia Republican gubernatorial primary between incumbent Georgia Governor Brian Kemp and the former Republican Senator from Georgia, David Perdue. Now this primary's gained a lot of attention mainly because Brian Kemp and David Perdue are both heavy hitters in Georgia Republican politics. Obviously a former senator and a current governor are pretty high profile positions within the state. And early on, Brian Kemp was somewhat vulnerable. Back in early 2021, we saw Brian Kemp have pretty poor numbers compared to where he's at today. In some cases, he was losing to Doug Collins, but against other candidates such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, he was clearing out the field. Even Herschel Walker he beat by 25%. So, early on, some Republicans sensed a lot of vulnerability against Brian Kemp, particularly with his feud with Trump. Moreover, Trump's problem with Brian Kemp, which soured a certain section of the Republican base to him. But in the past few months, ever since December 2021 even, when David Perdue actually joined the race, you had Vernon Jones leave the race, which, he was polling pretty poorly throughout the entire process. Even early on, couldn't get within 20 points of Brian Kemp. Thereabout, closest he got was 19%, maybe 18%. But even in some of these polls where Brian Kemp was still seen as vulnerable among the Republican base, he still held on pretty strong. And today, the current polling has him up in the aggregate by around 9 percentage points. And I think ultimately what you might see is that Brian Kemp might even overperform this number and get over 50% of the Republican primary vote when it's all said and done. Now, it's not a total foregone conclusion. This primary does happen at the end of May. And, perhaps Trump's rallying in the state of Georgia will make the primary a bit closer. But I think as of right now, it's certainly an uphill battle for David Perdue. But it's been a pretty messy campaign, to say the least. You have former President Trump going as far as to saying that Stacey Abrams would be a better governor than the current one, Brian Kemp, in a hypothetical situation where he wins again, where he basically says to a crowd, it's better off that Stacey Abrams were the governor of Georgia than Brian Kemp. And he was actually met with boos, and not a lot of Republicans wanted to hear this, especially Georgia Republicans, who are very ideologically opposed to Stacey Abrams. But for somebody like Trump, he's more interested in getting his guy in the race, David Perdue, than having Brian Kemp, who he sees as a political enemy, actually win a second term. Because, ironically enough, back in the 2018 election, Brian Kemp and Donald Trump had a really good relationship. Trump did a number of rallies across the state in places like Macon, Augusta. He held a number of rallies for Brian Kemp, and ultimately those rallies probably helped boost turnout to get Brian Kemp over the finish line against Stacey Abrams. He only won the governor race by 1.4%. Now, this was a blue wave year. Georgia in 2016 had voted for Trump by around 5%, so it moved about 4 points to the right. Other states around the country, such as, Michigan, for example, Pennsylvania, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, all these other states moved more, well, not Nevada, but all those other states moved more to the left than Georgia did in the 2018 election. And yet what we saw in 2020 was Georgia ended up going blue finally. It had kind of held out as a Republican stronghold and a slight, lean Republican state, even in 2018, but 2020 was too much, and ultimately the state ended up flipping blue. So I still think it's quite ironic that Donald Trump and Brian Kemp had such a good relationship, but of course the 2020 election and the fiasco that occurred afterwards kind of soured that relationship to a point where a certain segment of the base probably would rather see Stacey Abrams as governor than Brian Kemp. Although I would argue in this video that that segment of the Republican base is quite small, especially with midterms coming up. Biden's low approval among Republicans, which of course naturally is going to be extremely low, and even low approval across the nation, kind of in the same realm that Trump was in during his point in office. So bad blood between those two. Obviously, David Perdue is the former senator. He lost the 2021 special election to Jon Ossoff by about 1.4%. He overperformed his fellow senator, Kelly Loeffler, on the ballot. She ended up losing by 2 points. David Perdue, however, only lost by 1.4. Still not a really impressive showing. This was an off-year election. This was 2021. People called this the last election of 2020, and I guess you could say it was, because this really did determine the balance of power in the Senate And Biden was still popular enough at, right before his inauguration, where Democratic turnout was high enough to basically oust McConnell as the Senate Majority Leader and get a blue Senate for the first time since 2012. Now, David Perdue, in his first election to Senate, this was his first and only other election to Senate, he ended up beating his Democratic opponent 53 to 45%, which, given that 2014 was a red wave year, is kind of a average to even mediocre performance for a Republican. Obviously, he was a non-incumbent, but still, even 53% in a red wave year where other states were going a lot redder, than states like Georgia, wasn't really the best performance. But Georgia was never really a state to be impacted by red wave years or even blue wave years that much in the 2000s and 2010s. So I guess it's not terribly surprising. But he only ended up winning this race by about 8 points, which is about how much the state of Georgia voted for Mitt Romney back in 2012. So in 2020, when Donald Trump ended up losing the state by about 0.2%, interestingly enough, David Perdue actually won the first round with 49.7% of the vote to just 47.9% for Jon Ossoff. If Georgia had been any other state and didn't have runoff elections, David Perdue would still be in the Senate today. But I think David Perdue, who was originally mulling a run for the Senate race, decided it was probably best to run for governor since he believed that was his best shot, and he probably could smell the blood in the water between Trump and Brian Kemp. Now, Georgia will be a pretty important race in the midterms when determining Senate control, but even on the gubernatorial level as well in terms of state policy, because if Georgia keeps its Republican governor and its Republican legislature, then Republican priorities are going to continue to become law in the state of Georgia. If Georgia gets a Democratic governor, Republicans are going to have a much tougher time getting their legislation through, because even if Stacey Abrams does miraculously win the governor's race in 2022, I think it would be quite a long shot to say that the state legislature also flips. Because even in 2020, we didn't see that. Republicans won the popular vote in the state legislature, despite the state of Georgia going to Joe Biden by 0.2%. Now, even Trump in recent weeks has acknowledged that David Perdue at this point is a long shot for governor. If you look at the polling again, some of the latest polls, he's down by 9. In this poll, he's down 48 to 33, 50 to 39. He seems to be doing worse and worse. Brian Kemp seems to have the base more or less coalescing around him, to one of the reasons why I think that Brian Kemp will end up winning this primary with over a majority of the vote. I could easily see a situation where David Perdue maybe gets 40%, 30-something percent. I'll probably make a more finalized prediction of the Georgia primary when it comes around. But I think as of right now, Brian Kemp is the favorite in the Georgia primary. And I would argue, for Republicans, that he's the strongest candidate. Now, if we look at some of the hypothetical matchups down here between Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams, he's beating Stacey Abrams in every single poll that's been conducted so far. The latest one has him 51 to 44. Another poll that has him up by 5, 2, 7, so on and so forth. The polls with David Perdue and Stacey Abrams are much closer. David Perdue is only beating her by 3 points. So it shows that David Perdue could still definitely win, but he's a more risky candidate for the GOP. And if I were Brian Kemp, I'd be exploiting this weakness, because I think the last thing Republicans would want is a Democratic governor. And, especially in a state like Georgia that has been red for so brian. There's even a poll where David Perdue and Stacey Abrams are tied, 48 to 48. Currently, there's no real polls that have Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams actually tied. There's one poll that has Brian Kemp up only by 2, but the rest of the polls, he's in pretty good shape. So right off the bat from the polling, he's a stronger candidate. Also, Brian Kemp, to his credit, was able to hold on in a really rough year. I mean, he had the support of Donald Trump, but he still managed to win this governor's race by 1.4%, despite the hostile environment, despite the fact that Georgia was never really, a safe red state at this point. It was more of a lean red state, likely red state at most. And yet, with states like Texas only being a point or two redder, again, Texas voted for Trump by 9% in the 2016 election, Georgia only 5%. Brian Kemp did exceptionally well in this kind of environment, which kind of speaks to his viability as a general election candidate. Now, ultimately, I think that the Georgia governor's race, regardless of which candidate wins, is probably going to be lean Republican. Obviously, I think Brian Kemp will win by a larger margin, but I think there's a big segment of the Republican base that is sort of tired with the, former 2020 election. They'd rather move on and focus on the 2022 midterms. Trump and David Perdue seem to only want to talk about the last election for the most part. And I think ultimately that's going to sour their opinion of the candidacy, really, of David Perdue, because many Republicans are willing to move on from those events. And honestly, the more Trump talks about it, I think the more of his base he slowly loses, as over time people get more tired with the same talking points, and Trump's kind of targeting of, otherwise solid Republican candidates like, Brian Kemp, which most Republicans would argue has a solid conservative record. His only fault is that Donald Trump doesn't get along with him anymore. So I think that's going to play a huge role in the primary coming up. I expect Brian Kemp at this point to win the primary probably around 15 to 20 points, which I know sounds like a lot, but I think as time goes on, more of the base is going to consolidate around Brian Kemp. Now, obviously, this could change. Trump could rally in the state and make it a lot closer, but I think as of right now, Brian Kemp is probably the Republicans' nominee going into 2022. Anyway, guys, thank you all for watching this video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out, and as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.